So I will give you a lot of information, and I've tried to summarize it on one page, so you should have this colorful pager in your pack, and you may find that helpful just as a summary of the key points that I'm going to make. Okay, well, very many thanks for the invitation to address you here today. It's a real pleasure to be here. My task is to give you an overview of fixed-term parliaments in other jurisdictions. And when we refer to fixed and flexible parliamentary terms, we refer to the timing of elections, and in particular to the question whether early elections can be called, as previous speakers have already mentioned. Now, the timing of elections matters because elections are make or break moments in politics. They are opportunities for us as citizens to hold our politicians to account. And so they focus the minds of politicians. They are the focus of the electoral ambitions of politicians. They shape the work of governments and also the rhythm of policy cycles. And I will comment on each of these aspects as we go along. In most parliamentary democracies, legislative elections do not have fixed timing. That means, although parliaments have a maximum term, it is possible for politicians to call elections early. And in Europe, just under half of all elections are called early, before the end of the maximum term of parliament. Now, powers to threaten or call early elections have importance in parliamentary democracies for two reasons. The first reason is that the function of a parliament is to form and support a government in power. And on occasion, it is not possible for a government to come to an agreement to form for a parliament to come to an agreement to form a government and to support it in power. And so in that circumstance, parliamentary dissolution becomes a gridlock resolution device. You can think of it as a mechanism of last resort to give citizens the opportunity to elect a new parliament that may then tackle this task of forming the government or supporting the government again. Yeah? The second reason why early election calling is important and parliamentary dissolution is important is that it can be used by the politicians who have this power for partisan advantage. And we've already heard about this in the two previous presentations. So in particular, it is possible for a prime minister who controls this power to call an early election when he or she thinks that it is opportune and when they expect to win. And we can all think of instances in which prime ministers have called early elections because they've been doing well in the polls, because the economy has been doing well, or the opposition has been doing particularly badly. And as we've also heard in the two previous presentations, these powers to threaten an early election call can be used in bargaining between parties in a parliament. And a prime minister who can control this power can threaten parties or members even of his or her own party with an early election to make them give way, right? To concede on policy issues. Okay, I'll illustrate all of this as we go along. The first question I was asked to comment on is, what is a fixed or flexible parliamentary term? And you've already brought up that question in the previous Q&A round. So I'll try to give you an answer. The nature of the parliamentary term is set out in the Constitution. Fixed parliamentary terms allow no early elections. So constitutions that fix the parliamentary term completely do not permit early elections, and so election timing cannot be affected by politicians at all. So an example would be the US Constitution. It fixes the time between congressional elections, and that time span cannot be influenced by politicians. In Europe, there is only one parliamentary democracy that actually completely fixes the parliamentary term, and that is Norway. It is very rare for parliamentary democracies to completely fix the parliamentary term, and the reason for that is that the function of parliament is to form and support the government in power. And so when a parliament cannot do that, a safety valve is often desirable. Okay. So that takes us to flexible parliamentary terms. So flexible parliamentary terms, in a sense, is the entire rest, right? Flexible parliamentary terms allow early elections, and the timing of those early elections is influenced by politicians. Having said that, you need to be aware that the extent to which political choice influences the timing of elections is a matter of degree. And we've got the full variation, we've got the full spectrum. So on the one hand, you have constitutions like the UK before the introduction of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, where it is entirely up to the discretion of the Prime Minister to time an early election. Yeah? So it's entirely a political decision. On the other hand, you have constitutions like the Romanian one, which allows the early dissolution of parliament only after repeated failures to form a government and not within the final 6 months of the president's term. So in the Romanian case, it is very constrained under which circumstances politicians can actually trigger an early election. Yeah? So the room for discretion by politicians to trigger an early election can be varied in a very flexible way by constitutions. And we have the full spectrum. And that is why on your pager, we've tried to illustrate that there is, that there's a real arrow, right? There's a spectrum of opportunities involved. Okay. So at this point, you will ask yourself, you've heard about the UK Fixed Term Parliaments Act. You also know that there's been an election in 2017. Why am I talking about fixed and flexible terms in this way? I'd like to say that in common usage, there is a real confusion about this term, fixed term parliaments, right? And so what we know in the UK is that early election calling is possible. The power has simply been taken from the Prime Minister and given to Parliament. I'll explain in more detail later on exactly how it works. So this is not a fixed parliamentary term. And so what I'm going to do in this presentation is I'm going to refer to all constitutions in which early election calling is allowed but cannot be done by a single political actor as semi-fixed terms. It's not perfect terminology. Keep in mind that even when I'm referring to semi-fixed terms, there's a spectrum of constraints on politicians, but that's how I'm going to use it, and I'll explain to you more how that spectrum of constraints works. Yeah? Okay. I was asked to comment on who can call an early election. And before I can tell you more about that, I need to explain to you how a process that may lead to an early election actually unfolds, because often it's quite a complex process. So the first thing that you need to know is that multiple actors may be involved in the calling of an early election. So you may have a prime minister or the government collectively involved. You may have the legislature involved, and you may have the president involved. Moreover, these people may be involved in different roles and at different stages of the process. So let me just give you one example. Under many constitutions, the failure of the government to retain the confidence of Parliament allows the Prime Minister to seek a dissolution. And it may be the President who eventually decides the dissolution. So we have Parliament involved, which withdraws confidence from the government. We have the Prime Minister involved in a second step, who may then choose to seek a dissolution. And we have the President involved at the third step, who may then decide to grant or not to grant dissolution. Yeah? So we have multiple actors involved in different steps of the process. And finally, their ability to act may be constrained in various ways. So first of all, it may be conditional. So for instance, dissolution may only be allowed when the government fails or when government formation fails. Secondly, it may be time limited. So for instance, it may not be permitted within the last 6 months of the president's term, as I've explained to you is the case in Romania. Or it may be subject to the consent and consultation of other actors. So under some constitutions, presidents, for instance, have to consult with party leaders in parliament before they decide whether or not to dissolve. Okay, so now we understand the process, this fairly complex process of early election calling. And we can move on to the question, who has the power to call early elections in other countries? And so what I've done for you here is I've listed the different actors, the Prime Minister, the government, the legislature, and the President. And I've given you a sample here of the countries that I've studied and where I've sort of tried to gauge what power these different actors have to trigger early elections. And a score of where I've indicated that an actor has a lot of influence, high influence on early election calling. This is what, for instance, Australia PM, high, can you see that? Can I point? There, can you see that? Okay, the Australian Prime Minister has full discretion to call an early election. So that would be the case for a number of prime ministers here. So basically where we have a score of high, we have a very flexible parliamentary term. Where a score is absent, so if you go one down, Austria, the prime minister has not got a score. That means the Austrian prime minister has zero influence on calling an early election. Okay, so this is a fairly complex table. I'm going to point out 3 patterns in the comparative data to you. The first pattern that I want to point out to you is we only have one country here, Norway, in which there is no discretion for anyone to trigger an early election. So this is the exception amongst parliamentary democracies that I mentioned earlier. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a reason for that, because usually parliamentary dissolution is seen as a safety valve for gridlock and conflict situations. Second pattern that I want to point out to you is that prime ministers and governments are actors who most often have a lot of power to dissolve parliament. And if you look at the countries involved here, I think you will note that they're of 2 kinds. They're either older democracies, such as Belgium, Denmark, and the UK, or they're democracies whose constitutional choices were influenced by these older democracies. And you need a bit of historical context to understand why these democracies give so much power to prime ministers and governments to trigger early elections. So in these older democracies, it was usually parliaments who tried to negotiate for themselves with the monarchs. And what they did was they wrested the power of parliamentary dissolution from the monarch and then gave it to the parliament-supported government and weren't too much concerned about constraining that government. Yeah? Now, in the newer democracies, it then became clear that high discretion to dissolve parliament involves some advantages for the government, gives the government some advantages in bargaining with other parties. And so for that reason, newer democracies generally tend to have semi-fixed parliamentary terms. And that, I think, is what you see. Can you see most of these other scores that we have in the table are sort of low and medium, right? That means there are political actors who have some influence on early election calling, but they're constrained in one way or another, right? Okay, and so the idea here is to limit the executive's power to dissolve parliament, which means to curb the opportunity for government to derive partisan gain from this dissolution power, but preserve the access to early elections as a means to resolve gridlock and crisis. So with respect to the other actors who may be involved in parliamentary dissolution, the next pattern I want to highlight to you is that presidents are often involved. And that's particularly presidents, presidents are often involved. I'll just leave it at that. And finally, I want to point out to you that the legislature very often has a role in this whole process. And usually that arises because some action or omission or dysfunction by the legislature is required to open the path to dissolution. So, for instance, if a legislature votes no confidence in the government, or if a legislature refuses to pass the budget or doesn't pass the budget within a certain time limit, or if a legislature doesn't pass a confidence vote in a government or can't form a government, right? Those would be the circumstances in which constitutions then open the path to dissolution in many countries, yeah? Okay, so when can elections be called under semi-fixed terms? So just to recap, in this presentation I'm referring to semi-fixed terms as constitutions that allow early elections, but not at the discretion of a single political actor. So the question then for us becomes, how do these constitutions that envisage semi-fixed terms constrain the discretion of any one political actor to trigger an early election? And they do it in 3 different ways. First of all, they may involve multiple actors in the dissolution of parliament. So many constitutions envisage that the dissolution of parliament cannot happen unless, say, 2 institutions agree. Often it's the government and the president, right? Alternatively, they may set the majority requirement for a parliamentary dissolution very high, so that in effect you are forcing a cross-partisan majority to decide on parliamentary dissolution. This is the case in the UK under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act since 2011. A 2/3 majority in parliament is required, at least under one of the rules, to seek a parliamentary dissolution. The second way in which constitutions may constrain the discretion of any one political actor to seek dissolution is by making dissolution conditional on specific situations, such as the collapse of the government, failed government formation, or the failure to pass a budget, often within certain time limits. And thirdly, there may be temporal constraints on dissolution. So there are 2 types of temporal constraints that we very frequently find in constitutions. The first one is the prohibition of multiple elections in short succession. So often constitutions will state, if the last parliamentary election was within the last 6 months or within the last year, an early dissolution of the assembly is not allowed. And that is simply to say, we don't want multiple successive elections at short notice. The second condition under which temporal constraints are imposed on dissolution is often in systems where a president is popularly elected. And in these systems, there are often provisions in the Constitution to say Parliament shall not be dissolved in the last 6 months of the president's term or in the first 6 months of the president's term, simply to prevent a coordination of the parliamentary and the presidential term. Yeah? And because if you have elections for the presidency and parliament at approximately the same time, these 2 elections tend to influence each other. As a rule, we can say that as early election calling becomes more difficult, the greater the variety of different political actors that are involved in the process, and also the bigger the constraints that are imposed on early election calling. So that can be shown. Early elections become less frequent the more of these constraints constitutions impose. Then I was asked to comment on how long parliaments serve. So there's this distinction, which previous speakers have pointed out, between the constitutional term length and the actual term that parliament serves. So the constitutional term length just says this is the maximum term that a parliament may serve under our constitution. But then we have the question, how long do they actually serve, these parliaments? And the more flexible election timing is, the more scope there is for the actual length of the parliamentary term to diverge from the constitutional maximum. Okay, so I think there are 2 takeaway points from this. The first one is we have only one constitution in Europe with a completely fixed parliamentary term, and that's Norway, right? Which has a 4-year term for its parliament, and by definition, that parliament will actually serve 4 years, right? So we have the actual term length of 4 years. The constitutions that use semi-fixed term are in the majority amongst European democracies. On average, they envisage a parliamentary term of 4 years. So in fact, you get a minority of constitutions that have a 3-year term and 1 or 2 that have a 5-year term. The average is a 4-year term. Most of them have a 4-year term. And because early election calling is fairly difficult under these constitutions, most of these parliaments actually serve close to those 4 years. So on average, it's 3.8 years that these parliaments then actually serve. That doesn't mean that there aren't some parliaments in that sample that have a very short duration, yeah? But on average, you get something quite close to the constitutional term. And then we have the countries with flexible parliamentary terms, fully flexible parliamentary terms, where a prime minister typically can call elections as and when they see fit. Those tend to have a longer constitutional maximum term length, between 4 and 5 years. So 5-year terms are more common under those constitutions. But then look at the actual length that these parliaments serve. So even though these parliaments have the longest maximum term length, they serve the shortest actual time, on average 3.3 years. And so the takeaway point from this is that the actual length which a parliament serves reflects the ease with which early elections can be called. Next, I was asked to comment on what happens if semi-fixed or fixed terms are introduced. I'm going to comment on 4 effects that may transpire if semi-fixed or fixed terms are introduced. The first one concerns elections and the question of an incumbency advantage for the government. The second one concerns the frequency of elections and also government durations. The third one concerns the bargaining power of a government within Parliament in bargaining with other parties about policy. And the final question concerns economic policy or policy making in general and policy cycles. Okay, so turning to the first point, if a constitution introduces a semi-fixed or fixed parliamentary term, it takes away from the power of governments and prime ministers to time elections at will and to time elections when they expect that they can win. And what that does is it reduces the electoral bonus that governments can gain when they can time elections to opposition weakness, to strength of themselves in the polls. And so what we know from comparative research is that that vote share bonus is worth as much as 5% on average across a sample, very broad sample of European democracies. And so constitutions that reduce that power of governments, reduce that vote share advantage, and level the playing field between government and opposition. The second point concerns the frequency of early elections and government durations. So if a constitution introduces a semi-fixed or fixed parliamentary term, then it makes early election calling more difficult. By making early election calling more difficult, that constitution will reduce the frequency of early elections. So that is simply a mechanical matter. It will reduce the frequency of early elections and therefore the overall frequency of elections. But note that government duration is not necessarily extended. And the reason for that is that governments can leave office in 2 different ways. They can leave office through elections, including early elections, or they can just fall during a parliamentary term and be replaced by another government. And so when a constitution fixes the parliamentary term or makes early election calling more difficult, then what it does is it forces parties more frequently to resolve their differences within the confines of the existing parliament. So maybe through a vote of no confidence, the formation of a new government, new coalition formation. So those would be the kinds of negotiations that parties would then have to have. They simply have to think more about what are their options of governing within the existing parliament rather than going to an early election. Turning to the third point, taking away the power to dissolve parliament takes away from a government and the prime minister the option of threatening other parties that might fear an early election, or even threatening their own backbenchers who may fear an early election with an early election. And if you can use that threat, you can extract from those who fear an early election concessions, policy concessions. This is something that prime ministers and governments do, and as we heard in the previous panel, that threat does not need to be explicitly employed. The fact that it exists makes backbenchers and makes opposition parties and makes governing partners think in a different way about policy negotiations. And so when a constitution introduces a semi-fixed or a fixed parliamentary term, it takes away some of that power of the prime minister and government. Now think about the kinds of prime ministers and governments who would benefit most from this power of threatening an early election. It would be those prime ministers whose support within their party, whose support within their coalition, or whose support within parliament is precarious. So this power is most useful to weak governments with precarious support. So semi-fixed and fixed parliamentary terms make the life of weak governments marginally more difficult. Yeah? We can come back to this in questions. And finally, politicians, so this is about policy cycles. Fixing the parliamentary term, introducing semi-fixed parliamentary terms has an implication for the cyclicality of policies. Politicians do think about elections when they make policy. They think about elections because that's where they're held accountable and they want to win elections, generally speaking. So they tend to do two things with policy to improve their chances of re-election. They tend to implement policies that help their chances of re-election by improving voter welfare immediately prior to elections. And maybe these policies have costs after the elections that we don't observe. So a classic example would be tax cuts. We see tax cuts prior to the election. It improves our voter welfare. It makes us better off. It leaves more money in our pockets. And we don't see the effects until after the election. The other thing that politicians do is they avoid implementation of really costly policies, say austerity, immediately prior to an election. They leave that until a point in time when an election is far, far off. Yeah? And so when politicians can predict with certainty when an election will be, they will make policies in quite a cyclical manner. Yeah? So they will try to plan policies very strategically. When election timing is less certain, they will be less strategic in their policy making. Again, we can come back to that. Okay, finally, the UK Fixed Term Parliaments Act. So I was asked to comment on this, I guess, in part because it's got this strange title, and it's important. It's an important precedent. So the Act constrains the Prime Minister's discretion to dissolve Parliament, but it does not fix the parliamentary term. It creates what I would call a semi-fixed term. And that is because early elections can still be triggered in two ways under this Act. The first is if Parliament votes for an early election by a two-thirds majority of all MPs, and that's a majority of 434. And the second is if Parliament passes a no-confidence vote in the government with a simple majority and then fails to express confidence in a government within 14 days. So the Act basically creates opportunities for the opposition, in particular when the first path is used, to check the Prime Minister. And opposition parties may or may not choose to use that opportunity. And so just to talk you through what happened in 2017. In 2017, Theresa May took the first route to early election calling. So for her government, the circumstances in April 2017 looked very favorable. Unemployment was at an 11-year low. Growth, though weak, was better than forecast. Corbyn was deeply unpopular, the leader of the Labour Party, and Labour lagged 20 percentage points behind the Conservatives in the polls. So this looked incredibly favorable. And so what Theresa May did was she requested a vote to call an early election, a vote on the early dissolution of Parliament. Now, Labour chose not to oppose that early election call. It also chose not to abstain, which is something that the Scottish nationalists actually did. So if Labour had abstained, Theresa May would not have gained that two-thirds majority of all MPs. Yeah? So Corbyn chose not to oppose, and an early election was called under the Act by a two-thirds majority of Parliament. With a more assertive opposition, an opposition that might have chosen a different strategy, this Act would have been a powerful constraint on the Prime Minister. So thank you for your attention. I hope this has been useful, and I look forward to your questions.